And welcome to this seminar, which I know especially me and my students in the translation course, have been looking forward to very much. Welcome, Tim Parks. Thanks for joining us. And Tim will be with us today and tomorrow when he'll be talking about his novels. So we have Tim Parks as translator and Tim Parks as writer. Now, whether the two are entirely separate or whether they connect somewhere is something he can discuss at will, because what we'll do is Tim will give his own presentation so he can focus directly on some of the issues which are central to his book on translation, which we have looked at in our class and will continue to look at, the issue of style in translation. Translating style as opposed to translating plot, as opposed to translating story, is a matter of much difficulty, interest, and brings down questions of translatability or possible untranslatability, and the signature of the writer. Can you recognize a writer in another language? And if you do, it's probably a matter of style that is somehow conveyed, if that is even possible. But I'm sure we'll be hearing quite a lot about that. A few words, perhaps, to give you some context about Tim Parks and his background. He was born in Manchester, moved to London as a child, went to school in London, and then studied at Cambridge and Harvard. Significantly, in 1981, he moved to Italy, where he's lived for about 35 years, I take it, Tim, is that right? It's about that? 37 now, since we... That's right, 81, my mathematics, there you are. He's written all of 11 novels. Oh, 12 now? 13? This is really out of date. And I thought I was doing proper research. No. Okay, all of 18 novels and one book on translation. Okay. Well, that's my bit, so at least I got that bit right. One very insightful book on translation. Tim translates from Italian to English, and some of the writers he's worked on are Italo Calvino, Roberto Calasso, Tabucchi, Moravia, and even Machiavelli. He's won 2 prizes in translation, the John Florio and the Italo Calvino Awards, both for literary translation. And I think finds himself equally at home in Italy as in England, with all its quirky habits. Actually, both places are very full of very quirky habits. So I think one would need to feel very comfortable on both sides of the coin if you're going to work in translation. I'll leave you to Tim and his presentation, as we go along, if things turn up that might need a little word or two, a little question as we go along, we might be sort of interrupting each other a little. And at the end, after we'll exchange a few points about style, about translation, would like to open the floor to your questions, and we encourage, it's really nice, really interesting to have your questions become part of our dialogue, our debate. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah.
Careful.
Yeah, no, I've got this. I'm all right, yeah. Oh, she's been clicking by mistake. That's a scandal. No, wait a minute. There we go. Don't want them to read that yet. Okay. One book on translation is quite enough. Yeah. You don't need to pay any attention to those prizes. Many people have won the prizes that I won, whose translations I think are awful. So there's really no need to pay any attention to that stuff at all. So I just have like 20 minutes, half an hour. I want to say something very general to start. I want to start with, you might consider it a riddle, really. When is a book not a book? Okay? When is a book not a book? Well, we won't spend too long over that. I'll give you the answer. A book's not a book when it doesn't have a reader. Okay? If we imagine in some form or other signs on some kind of surface, be it paper, be it stone, be it a screen, or even a hologram, and we don't know how to put those signs together in sequence. We don't know if they are a sequence. We don't know if it is language, even though our cultural background would encourage us to think it was language. But basically, if we can't interpret those signs, nothing is happening, and we don't know if these signs are talking about something or what it is, or and so on. So, although when we look at the books on the shelves, it seems that we're possessing literature, as it were, those books only happen when somebody reads them. And this is a very important basic thing to take on board. A book is not a book when it's not being read. Okay. So the question is, when it's being read, what book is it? If it requires a reader, and if readers tend to be different, obviously. So a book in one person's hands is a very different experience from a book in somebody else's hands. And again, I want to insist that the book exists only as an experience. Obviously, the signs on the page are going to remain what they are. And there are going to be some people whose opinion about the book we may respect more than somebody else's. Okay. But the book will happen in a different way for everybody, and in a different way for the same person when he comes back to it, even if he comes back to it only a couple of weeks later. In fact, probably especially if he comes back to it only a couple of weeks later. So why is all this interesting? Because I think the first thing it sets up for us then is, so what is the perfect reader for a book in such a way that the book would, as it were, exist as fully as a complicated book could exist? But the answer is, first, it has to be somebody who can read the damn language, okay? And obviously, the better you can read the language, the more the book is going to happen. I'm sure you all know from your own language acquisition that the experience of reading in a foreign language changes as you get deeper into it, okay? And the more context you have. So for example, imagine I read a book written by Martin Amis about London in the 1970s when I was still in London. This is a book I can agree with or disagree with. It's a book I can say, wow, that's right, it was really like that. Or I can say, no, Martin, that's complete. Well, no, I won't use that word I was going to use, but as rubbish, we could say, and so on. I enter into an argument with Martin Amis because I know London in the 1970s. It's already different if I read Dickens on London in the 1850s or 60s. But if I read a Korean author, for example, talking about Korea today, I will probably automatically believe that they're telling me the truth, even though I know absolutely nothing, zero, about Korea. So what does that mean? It means the text changes according to whether you are part of the community around the writer. Okay. So a writer writes a book, and the people close to that writer are going to be more aware of what's going on in the book. So, for example, when Martin Amis writes about sex, sexual relationships, marriages, and stuff like that, I'm sure his wives and ex-girlfriends will have a different experience of the book than other people will, and that's completely legitimate. And a lot of writers, I'm quite sure, use their novels and books to send messages to people close to them that they would not be able to speak openly about. So novels have and any form of writing has a communicative ability which can be directed at different communities. So let's try and move this on to the idea of translation. What happens if a book can't happen for me at all because I open the pages and it's Cyrillic text or it's Arabic or it's Japanese and it's just nothing to me? It could be a shopping list. So I want somebody else to intervene, read that book for me, and then write it for me in my language, okay? So I think the first thing you'd want to say is, I would like that person to know the language as well as possible, okay? Now this may seem an inevitable thing to say, but there's an awful lot of rhetoric in the translation world today suggesting that, that what really matters most is that you can write in your own language, something that Dryden already said. And obviously writing well in your own language is a prerequisite. But if I want that book to come through to me, I need to know the book really happened for that person. And for it to really happen for that person, they have to have the context, they have to have the language, they have to be very close. They can't know the language as well as a native speaker, if we're talking about the standard translation situation where I translate from an acquired language. We hear so much about the translator being the best reader of a text and the closest reader of the text. But this is obviously nonsense when the text is going to happen most for somebody right in that community and culture. Certainly the translator hopefully reads it closely, but that doesn't always mean that they're the best reader. So we want a translator who's very, very close to the text, but who then, and being close to the text and in that community, or close to that community, they can begin to understand the special things about the text. And then they have the enormous problem of making that happen in our language. And of course, one of the problems is that our language has a completely different context, that each of us brings a different world to a book when we start reading it. Even ordinary things like mother-child relationships, like love relationships, may be completely different in Japan than here, so that when we read the book, a lot of it may not really make sense to us, or we may understand it in a completely different way from the way it was meant in that community. What I want to do is just look at a couple of texts and try and suggest all the problems involved in this. And I've chosen two texts, one a little text in English that we're going to look at how that comes out in Italian, and then a little text in Italian and how that comes out in English. And I've chosen stuff where, honestly, the style is pretty extreme. That is, you can't miss it. And so that'll help us. What I want us to try and understand is that style only really happens if we have a community of people who can recognize what standard writing is like, okay? Style is not going to happen if you don't know the language very well. So let's take a look at this. This is a very famous opening paragraph of a book published in, I think, 1938. Fog was so dense, bird that had been disturbed went flat into a balustrade and slowly fell dead at her feet. There it lay. And Miss Fellows looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot above and out of which it had fallen, turning over once. She bent down and took a wing, then entered a tunnel in front of her, and this had departures lit up over it carrying her dead pigeon. Okay. Well, I think just looking at that, obviously it's impossible for me to know where this particular community is with English. I'm told, Ivan tells me everybody here speaks excellent English and understands everything, and that's great. This text will then obviously appear to you immediately as somewhat strange, and also strange in a way that's sort of homogeneous. Like you can feel as I read it that the same strangenesses are occurring at different times. If we look, for example, at the deixis, that is the way articles and pronouns are used, you can see in that first sentence, fog was so dense, bird that had been disturbed, is hardly correct English. Fog. Can we start a sentence with fog without an article? Well, we can. We can say fog is quite common in the Po Valley, for example. Or even fog was a major problem in London in the 1950s. That is, we can use it generically, but we cannot say fog was so dense. We would have to say the fog was so dense. So we have somebody who's changing the normal rules of writing. And for an English person, I think they would immediately start to hear a possible dialect use, seeing as in the northern dialects of Lancashire and Yorkshire, it would be quite common to drop that article. So you would have something like, fog was so dense, bird that had been disturbed flew straight into a balustrade. So it could be like that, except that all the other things that would indicate that dialect are not there. So it's a strange use. Also strange that there's no article before bird. Then curious that there is an article before balustrade. And then we have her feet without knowing who she is. Then we have things like that pall of fog. There it lay, and Miss Fellows looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot, not feet, above, and out of which it had fallen. And then later, this had departures. Just notice that when you use a demonstrative pronoun like that, it changes the feeling of the text, not just because of its pointing, but also because of the sound. The normal definite article is unstressed, the. She looked up to where the pall of fog, okay? She looked up to where that pall of fog, okay? Everything sounds slightly odd. And then we have this crazy sentence. This is a completely crazy sentence. Miss Fellows looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot above and. So what does a normal reader expect after that end? They expect, and very thick. She looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot above and very thick. Or a very dark. Or she looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot above and decided to pick up the pigeon. All these are standard sentences, but instead we have this. Looked up to where that pall of fog was 20 foot above and out of which. And it's kind of hard to understand if that's actually correct or not. It feels a bit like one of those cubist paintings where things are attached together, but there's a sort of slight shift. That would be the correct form at the bottom. Miss Fellows looked up to where that pall of fog, out of which the pigeon had fallen, was 20 foot above or 20 feet above. So what am I trying to say here? Whatever we may think about the mad curiosity of this opening, which obviously the writer Henry Green is trying to make us feel that we've entered a fog, a kind of syntactical fog, a lexical fog. The pigeon has gone and banged against the balustrade, and we're banging against pretty much everything in this text. Whatever you may think about that, that is only going to happen for somebody who knows English well enough to feel that it's all crazy. Okay, it's not going to happen to somebody who learned English last week or somebody who's using Google Translate and so on. Okay, so style requires a community. It requires a community of people who recognize it. What can we do about that when we translate in Italian, where the use of the articles is all different? Okay, Or even the words, just look at the words here, for example, and we begin to notice that there's a lot of alliteration. Fog, flat, fell feet, dense, bird, disturbed, balustrade, dead. Fog was so dense, bird that had been disturbed. And you can see the kind of violence of this passage. What are we going to do about that? Let's imagine that we wrote it in a standard English. There was such a dense fog that evening that a bird that had been disturbed flew straight into a balustrade and fell dead at Miss Fellowes' feet. Standard, okay. Standard, and notice that I've introduced that evening, because when we do standard stuff, the content changes. So Clare suggested, content and form, what's going on. Frankly, I think content and form only exist as ideas because we have the word content and we have the word form. But in reality, form is always determining content, and content is related to form. They don't happen separately. There is no content without form, and there is no form without content. And the two come together in ways that are mutually conditioning. So, I won't read all of that. We don't have that much time. These are just the things I had to add. Just notice some crazy things here. So is this going to go backwards for me? Yes. On that second paragraph there, the bird lay on the ground and Miss Fellowes looked up 20 feet to the curtain of fog from which it had fallen, turning over once as it did so. She bent down and picked the bird up by a wing. The English was, the original was, she took a wing. She took a wing, okay? And then entered a tunnel that had a illuminated sign over it, which read departures. I haven't added carrying her dead pigeon because we've already understood that she's carrying. So why has he added that? It's as if he adds things to stop the sentence from ending at the right place. Stop the sentence ending at the right place. Here, let's move on to the Italian then. This book was bought in the 1960s by Adelphi, who had about 20 translators try to translate it, and they rejected all of them. And this is the translation that they finally published, and frankly, I don't think they should have, in 2001. And the reason why I don't think they should, I saw some of the rejected translations, which I thought were much, much more interesting. Let's have a look at this. La nebbia era densa. Un uccello che era stato disturbato colpì in pieno una balustrata e lentamente cadde, morto a pochi passi da lei. Notice that in this version, I had cut out slowly fell, because everything falls at the same speed. So slowly fell is nuts. Okay, you can't slowly fall. But, yeah, I have to point it this way to make things happen. Wait a minute. Now I've got, oh dear. I'm going the wrong... Why is it going the wrong way? Help me. Why is this happening to me? I do seem to be... Ah, no, there we go. I was pressing the wrong damn thing. Okay, I'm fine now. Okay, so let's move here. La nebbia era densa, un uccello che era stato disturbato colpì in pieno, eccetera, eccetera. And I've put in a back translation in English just to see what it feels like if we go back to English. The fog was thick, a bird that had been disturbed hit a balustrade full on and slowly fell dead a few steps away from her. A few steps away from her? Where did that come from? Just notice that fog was so thick has disappeared. Fog was so dense. In Green's book, which all happens in one evening, everything depends on the fog. Okay? As a result of the fog, a group of people get blocked in a railway station for the evening, and a whole series of conversations and relationships develops and takes place, all because of the fog. Okay? And the characters seem to move in a fog. Here, the Italian actually removes la nebbia era così densa, and just puts fog was, la nebbia era densa, un uccello che era, okay. And it removes that causality, okay? And this, I'll just give you quickly this. Lì giaceva la signorina Fellows, guardò in alto, dove a 7 metri da terra c'era quel manto di nebbia dal quale era caduto, girandosi una volta. si chinò e lo prese per un'ala, poi scese in un sottopassaggio davanti a lei con sopra l'insegna partenze, portando il suo piccione morto. Everything is completely standard. There it lay, and Miss Fellows looked up where 7 meters from the ground there was that cloak of fog from which it had fallen. Turning over once, she bent down and picked it up by a wing, then went down into a subway in front of her with the sign departures over it, carrying her dead pigeon. So everything's become standard and kind of less exciting. Particularly things like, she took a wing. In English, to take wing, we remember, means take off, start to fly. And in fact, Miss Fellows, picking up the pigeon, is moving towards her death, okay? She picks up the dead pigeon and she will die at the end of the novel. And so she's sort of taking wing, as it were. She took a wing. Henry Green, very, very funny, strange writer. Also, the word departures obviously recalls death, and the way it's established is quite important. So all of this, just to say, this is an impossibly difficult piece to translate. For its effects, it depends on a community of people who read a lot and who are surprised to find this stuff coming out like this, okay? So the translator has this huge problem. Do I normalize it? Do I try and do something? Here, just to finish this, is one of the translations that was rejected, that I thought was pretty interesting. Era nebbia così densa, l'uccello che era stato disturbato sbatté contro una balustrata e cadde lentamente morto ai suoi piedi. Giaceva lì e Miss Fellows guardò in alto, dove 6 metri più su c'era quel manto di nebbia, e da dove l'uccello era caduto. I take my hat off to somebody willing to introduce that crazy E into the text there, con una capovolta. Si chinò e lo sollevò per un'ala, quindi entrò in un sottopassaggio di fronte a lei e su questo brillava la scritta partenze, portando il suo piccione morto. This was rejected by Delphi as not Italian. Well, I don't want to discuss that. So, do we have time to look at one other? Okay, so now I hope that what I've said makes some sense. The more we know English, the more we know the texts around Henry Green's text, the more we're aware of the kind of literary experiments of the period, the more this text means to us, okay? So we need a translator who really understands that, and then we need somebody who's really rather adventurous with Italian, and you have to ask yourself, can this be done or can't it, okay? So much for that. Let's have a look now at something a bit more, just as stylistically crazy, but very much more traditional. Giovanni Verga. Unfortunately, most people read I Malavoglia, and I think a lot of them get bored. But in fact, Verga is terribly exciting in his short stories. And this is the opening of a short story called Galant Uomini, okay? So just take a look at this. We'll look at this, and again, this is pretty crazy. Sanno scrivere, qui sta il guaio. Sanno scrivere, qui sta il guaio. Let's just remember that in the whole of Western culture, and particularly literary culture, being able to write is considered a hugely positive thing, okay? So starting the text by saying sanno scrivere, and one says, well, everybody knows how to write, but obviously not in this community, otherwise it wouldn't have been foregrounded. And then you say, and this is a problem. Okay, so already the text is totally provocative just in those 5 opening words. Sanno scrivere, qui sta il guaio. Then we have a fantastically complicated sentence. La brinata dell'alba scura e il soleone della messe se li pigliano come tutti gli altri poveri diavoli, giacché sono fatti di carne ed osso come il prossimo. per andare a sorvegliare che il prossimo non rubi loro il tempo e il denaro della giornata. Ma se avete a fare con essi, vi uncinano nome e cognome e chi vi ha fatto col beccuccio di quella penna e non ve ne districate più dai loro libracci inchiodati nel debito. It's interesting that when I show this to even Italian students, first year postgraduate, they often have trouble actually understanding what on earth the text is about, which actually worries me because it doesn't look that difficult, but or not to me. But what I mean is, again, you understand what you can bring to the text, and if you don't read enough and aren't involved enough, this text is not going to happen for you. So let's just try and get a grasp on the thing. Wait a minute. Here is, I have written an easy version in standard Italian to go through this. Il problema è che sanno scrivere. Soffrono il freddo d'inverno e il caldo d'estate come qualunque altro essere umano quando vanno a sorvegliare il bracciante per vedere che non gli rubi tempo e denaro. So, we are speaking about the boss who goes around to look at the guys working for him and check they're not cheating, okay? Check they're not having a cigarette or a drink or going home too long for lunch or whatever. Ma se hai a che fare con loro, scrivono il tuo nome e cognome e quello dei tuoi genitori nei loro taccuini e non riuscirai più a liberartene, sarai sempre indebitato con loro. Okay, so you borrow money from them and then they write it down and as soon as that's happened, you're dead. Okay, so this is Verga with his social conscience and everything. And you notice how different the text is now I've written it like that. Notice above all that the word prossimo has disappeared. Where was it? Yeah, here. I can actually use this. Look here. Okay, there we are. There's the word prossimo. You can see my handshake. Okay. They get cold because they're made of flesh and blood like il prossimo. And we remember that the prossimo is biblical, you know, the prossimo. The commandments, love your neighbor. There was a man on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he saw, etc., a Samaritan on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. So this word, biblical word prossimo, is brought in. He is like anybody else, il prossimo, but then he goes to sorvegliare il prossimo, and you can see the irony of it. Instead of loving your neighbor, you're watching your neighbor to see he doesn't cheat you. How difficult is it to translate that? And then notice this clever game with the pen. Vi uncinano, they hook you with the beccuccio, with the little beak of their pen, and you are inchiodati nel debito. So you've got a nice extended metaphor developing in the text there. And all that kind of stuff has to be picked up by a translator. This was a basic translation that I did of my easy Italian version. The problem is they know how to write. They suffer the winter cold and the summer heat like any other human being when they go to watch over their laborers to check that they're not cheating them out of time and money. But if you get mixed up with them, they'll write your name and surname and your parents' names down in their notebooks and you won't be able to escape. You'll always be in debt to them. Notice that everything has disappeared from there. The neighbors, the hooking, the inchiodato, everything. This is the published version, Penguin Classics, and it uses a title, Bigwigs. How different is Bigwigs from Galantuomini? How can you translate galantuomini? What a frightening word that is. Anyway, he writes, the trouble is they know how to write. They're made of flesh and blood like the rest, so like any other poor devil, they put up with the hoarfrost on a dark morning and the dog days at harvest time, so as to keep watch on their workers and make sure they're not wasting their time and robbing them of a day's wages. Very good. But once they get their claws into you, so their claws, not their pen, they jot down your name, surname and parentage with those pens of theirs, and you never get out of their grubby little books. You're in debt up to your ears. So the extended metaphor of the pen has gone. Instead, we've got claws, which seems a bit strange, and the neighbor has gone. So maybe a different translation, it might have been possible. I offer this translation and then I'll stop. But what I'm suggesting in this translation is we want somebody obsessed by everything that's happening in the original and then to try and make it happen in our language as far as it can. They can write, that's the rub. Bit of Hamlet in That's the Rub, but they can write, that's the rub. They feel the frost on a winter dawn and the burning sun in summer as much as any other poor devil. Made as they are of flesh and blood, like their neighbor, and out there keeping watch on their neighbor to see he doesn't cheat them out of time and money. But if you get involved with them, they pin down your name and surname and your fathers and mothers with their sharp pens, and you'll never be free of their nasty books nailed down in debt. Okay, so just I think I'll close on that. I think, case closed. Enough. Yeah, these are the open. I choose opening paragraphs because I don't want there to be other context that people don't know about. So otherwise it gets very confusing. Yeah, let's. And I would have called the thing honorables, because that's another dangerous word. But
you didn't like the men of honor in the first translation.
Well, men of honor is not a bad. Yeah, that was my own. That was also my own version. But I'd love to translate Verga. Unfortunately, I'm told there's no market for him. Markets. I think there would be a market for him. Maybe if I translated him, but that sounds rather arrogant. So let's call it a day there. Yeah. Okay.
You say there's no distinction between form and content, and yet I think what you've shown in the good, more acceptable translation and the less acceptable translation is that one just focused on content and got what happened across, whereas the other did more.
Well,
and got the extended metaphor, perhaps.
Did they get what happened across? They got some elements of the text across. Okay. If by what happened we mean the movement of people and objects in the text, they got the text across. But if by what happened we mean the experience of reading the book, okay, and let me say that books are only an experience of reading a book. There is nothing else. There is just you reading the book and what happens, what is that experience. If someone wants to then come along and start trying to break all this down, that's a different matter, but it's no longer the book. It's something else.
But it's no longer the book, or it's a diminished version of the book.
Do we really need to?
No, we don't need a diminished version. But
but do we really need to categorize exactly what it is?
No, but isn't that in losing the style, in losing the wordplay, in losing the references, in losing the experience, the effect of the original reader that the original reader might have got, and missing out on all of that in the translation, the reading experience, so the book, in the new audience, in the target audience, just isn't the same experience. What is it lacking? It's lacking exactly all the bits of language, the references, the experiences that the translator didn't pick up, or picked up and didn't know what to do with, or his editor decided it wasn't good Italian or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, this is the kind of position I had when I wrote that book, Translating Style, 20 years ago, yeah. This is, like, you've articulated pretty much what my position was at the time. I now feel a little bit differently about it. I just feel that all these categories that we introduced, like style, as a word, as if we knew what we were talking about, and like content, as if we knew what we were talking about. I feel these words help us to go a certain distance, but at a certain point, they themselves are arbitrary. Language divides the world into separate things. We know that each language divides the world differently, so that some words have a vast extension of meaning in one language and then only a little part of that meaning in another language. So these words could be helpful, but frankly, I think at the end of the day, when you say what is different? First, every reading of the book is different.
Yes.
And second, it's going to be tendentially different in a certain way if we've changed it in this particular way. I mean, let me give you a dumb example of that you could say was a clear example of a content error, okay? Yeah. So I'm reading a new translation of Bassani, Giorgio Bassani. There's a story in this about a guy who comes back to the small town of Ferrara, a Jew who has been to, I think, Buchenwald or Auschwitz, I can't remember which of the awful places, and he returns, and the story is really about his relationship with the community and their difficulty in dealing with him, and also how different his views are from what you would expect. Now, at a certain point in this text, there's the expression il sedicente profugo, or il sedicento, I think it's il sedicente profugo, the self-styled, the self-declared refugee or returnee or whatever. And he's translated the 16-year-old. Right. So he's made like a dumb mistake. The word sedicente has been translated as if it was sedicenne. And not only a dumb mistake, because in standard Italian it will be il profugo sedicenne, non il sedicenne profugo. So he doesn't seem to realize that, that would come up. So this, you could say is this pedantic pointing this out? No. It changes everything in the story to think that the guy is 16. In fact, if we go back and look at the kind of people that we can find out pretty much who Bassani was referring to, and it was a cousin of his, and this cousin was in fact 26. Funnily enough, the word 6 is there, but it's just completely arbitrary. He was 26. So what have we changed when we've changed that? Well, funnily enough, we've changed everything. To think that the guy is only an adolescent changes the whole way we feel about what happens between him and the community. It's a devastatingly dumb mistake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that there are
I get angry about that
levels of mistakes. And I think you bring that up very well in this recent article in the New York Review of Books. The translation deserves scrutiny, accuracy.
Yeah, the title's not mine, but it's a good title.
Yeah, but really about accuracy in translation. So what you've just spoken about, sedicenne or sedicento, that's a problem, perhaps not even of misinterpretation, perhaps being very tired or not checking your work. Or I don't know. It's
just
so
totally
stupid.
unforgivable.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, well, I mean, also
it's just wrong.
The editors should have picked it up.
Yeah.
Let me.
But then
let me say why this article got written. Actually, the mistakes I refer to are from the translation of Bassani. I disguised them. Okay. I disguised them a bit so they wouldn't be recognized. There is in the field of translation today, and there has always been, way back to the beginning, a kind of discussion about whether translation is a cause or a discipline. That is, there is a lot of rhetoric in the world of translation today which suggests that translation is of its nature virtuous and possibly helpful in saving the world. Like at the beginning of this, at the beginning of this, I mentioned a famous Paul Auster quotation: "Translators are the shadow heroes of literature, the often forgotten instruments who have enabled us to understand that we all from every part of the world live in one world." Okay. Well, that seems rather extravagant. You know, I think I would have got there without translation. And I can't help feeling that Paul Auster was trying to please a particular crowd when he said that. But it's the kind of thing that translators love to hear. Or in another a publisher's catalogue, we hear them celebrating the translators because they have made these books possible in English, and so on and so forth. So there's this rhetoric that translation is always good, and if you start criticizing a particular translation, they just say, well, this is just pedantic, this is just details, what matters is... I don't feel like that at all. I don't think there's anything specially virtuous about translating. I don't think there's anything specially that will save the world about translating. I think if we remember in the 1920s and 30s, before the Second War, the countries that translated most in the world were Italy and Germany. And the country that translates most in the world today is still Italy. And, you know, are we moving into a phase of great virtue in Italian politics? Well, I leave it at that. You know, I don't want to interfere with anybody's particular views, but obviously I don't feel that's happening. So I think it's best if we leave the idea of cause out of the way. I do think reading in general can be construed as very positive in introducing you into a world of feeling which is not yours. Yes. So that's kind of exciting. It's exciting to read Henry Green.
Yeah, culturally different.
Right. So you just say, oh my God, people are actually different from me. They actually have these different experiences. So,
all similar.
Right, all similar, yeah.
Yes. I think there are two things that come out here. One, you know, this business of accuracy and yes, this virtuous, you know, multicultural, you know, through translation we get to know, and all of that rhetoric, agreed. But then there's also something else. This, in very contemporary translation theory, you know, there's the notion of rewriting you know, your title was the translator as writer, as well as reader. I mean, how far is the translator writer, rewriter? How far can he change, or she change, the text? And it's not a question of making mistakes then, it's deliberate. When does maybe translation not remain a translation? I don't. There seems to be a lot of. Okay, don't go there.
I just want to ask you. No, can I ask you? Let me ask you a question.
All right.
When you talk about changing the text, we all know, you know, right back to Cicero and Jerome, that, you know, they understood perfectly well that to say the same thing, you have to change the syntax, you have to move things around. But when you say change the text, what are the criteria for doing that? Like, what criteria were you talking about for changing the text?
There seems to be a lot of this sense of translator as author almost taking the text and making it their own, and taking liberties, leaving out, adding, maybe because they understand the target audience better, sort of, you know.
Understand the target audience better than whom?
Than the new target audience. So they
so
are
better
translating
than the writer.
The writer wrote for his audience. This is a different audience. How? Okay.
So let me just read this. This is kind of an answer to this question. Stendhal. Stendhal was translating some 17th century Italian texts into French, and this is part of his introduction. So he says, my literary vanity whispers to me that perhaps I might augment the interest of certain situations by inferring and then reporting to the reader the details of what the characters thought and felt. But I, being a young Frenchman born in the north, in Paris, can I really be sure I can correctly infer what Italian minds thought and felt in 1559? the best I can hope for is to divine what might appear elegant and piquant to French readers in 1838. So this is exactly that. He says, okay, I could write towards the new audience, but what a bore that would be. Because the reason I chose to translate these texts is because they're so wild and so crazy. And in fact, he poses this problem because he says French people are not really going to believe how mad those Italians were in the 16th century. Okay. And if translation has any virtue at all, it is its openness. It's listening carefully to difference. Okay. I would say that the translator does have an ethical duty to do that. So the only criteria for changing things is to get closer to your own experience of reading the original, okay? Your own experience of reading the original was this. So that is the book for you. And the only criteria I have for moving syntax around, for maybe having to insert something because something won't be clear to people who don't have a certain context, the only reason for doing that is to get close to the experience of reading the book. Any other criteria, honestly, is vanity, my literary vanity. You know.
It's a little bit what Umberto Eco said in his experiences in translation. The intention should be to try and convey the same effect to the new reader as the original reader felt. So you felt reading the text that you'd like to somehow create those same effects, that same experience in the new text for the new reader.
Frankly, this all seems terribly commonplace, you know.
Yeah,
right, and we wouldn't read Eco's book if it wasn't written by Eco. It's not an interesting book about translation.
No, the first one is Experiences in Translation. Is
yeah, maybe
Mouse
that.
or
Yeah,
Rat,
yeah.
I don't like so much, but Experiences in Translation, yes.
Yeah, he didn't translate very much.
No.
He didn't seem to be aware that his own books translated into English were very poorly translated and very heavily manipulated. I don't give much credit, honestly, to...
Weaver.
Well, no, Weaver unfortunately just made endless errors, although he was better than this guy who translated. Weaver had the problem that he had so much work, he was giving a lot of the work to other people and then signing his name on it. So that was a major issue with Weaver's work, particularly things like The Ruin of Cash. I know that, for example, Elsa Morante's La Storia was completely rewritten by the publisher. I saw the translation of Il Pendolo di Foucault, and every line had been rewritten because it was unpresentable.
The start of that. But before we launch into a debate on Eco, because we can do that later, why don't we open this? I'm sure we have a
little bit of provocation to wake everybody up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd love to open to the floor any questions. Yes, there we already have one, two.
Okay, please. Go ahead. Far away.
I'm sorry for my question because I'm not an
apology.
It's a little stupid, but I would like to ask you what you think about this Google translation for someone who don't understand very much English.
Yeah, or DeepL is the other one, right? DeepL there's Google Translate and DeepL. There are various modes. I think DeepL is actually slightly better for some. Well, you know, let's first say it can be incredibly useful. You know, I get a letter to me in Slovenian from somebody. I don't understand a word of Slovenian. I stick it in there. I see at least what it was supposed to be about. I often use Google Translate when, for example, I'm traveling in Germany and somebody sends me some instructions in German. I do speak German a bit, but I check it out. I think the thing we just have to remember is what is the nature of the tool I'm using when I use Google Translate. Okay, so let's just remember that first, the computer doesn't know that it's translating. Second, it doesn't know what language is. Third, it's not going to laugh at any of the jokes, and it's not going to know when it's made a mistake. That is, the computer The computer does not exist as an identity or entity that is translating. It is not even translating correspondences of one word with another word. It is simply looking in its vast and vast database for every time that string of words has occurred and how it has been translated, okay? So one of its problems is to identify the string of words, okay? Because often it breaks up the sentences incorrectly. One of the problems is to identify, for example, if a word is a name or a noun. For example, if you put my name in Google Translate in an article about me, it will come out, say, in Italian, it will come out as Tim Parchi, right? Because Parks just gets translated, okay? So if we accept that, there was the very funny moment in Google Translate was when the New Yorker decided that Google Translate was amazing because they put the first sentence of 100 Years of Solitude in Google Translate, and it came out exactly like the translation. Well, thanks a lot. It came out exactly like the translation because the damn thing had it in its database.
Yes. Okay.
So there was, no prizes for repeating what somebody else has done.
Let's leave the lack of style in Google Translate and move back.
But it is an extraordinary achievement, and it's sometimes. Yes,
it is.
If you need it's useful.
But it doesn't have pragmatic, doesn't have context.
Most of all, it can't do anything new because it can only do what's done before.
Yeah. So you're not going to create any new style.
Like everything with the computer is basically conservative linguistically. Just like word spell check nails us to our present spelling. Mm-hmm. Well, never trust a man who only knows one way to spell a word, said Mark Twain. And it was an interesting.
It came up yesterday in class. Ivan, you had.
You've spoken out. Thanks. You've spoken both today and on other occasions about the need to call out bad translation. And you've also referred...
That's my need. I don't think it's a general need.
Yeah. Fair enough. And you've also referred today to Adelphi and their choice of the Henry Green translation. And I find that interesting because Adelphi are, of course, not just any publisher. The levels of curation are famously careful also because of Roberto Calasso's input and care over various things in that context. So my question, I guess, is probably naive, but how does it happen that there aren't better safeguards within publishing over translations that might be just a bit casual?
Okay, so Adelphi, we all have to thank Adelphi for as Italian readers, in particular for the vast amount of material they've translated from Middle Europe, and so we don't have to thank them for their translations from English. The Adelphi, you speak of they are terribly serious. They are terribly serious in defending an idea of belles lettres in Italy. So when one reads, I've just been reading Christina Stead's great novel Letty Fox with my students in the Adelphi translation. It is completely rewritten towards an Italian standard of belles lettres that has got nothing at all to do with Christina Stead, which completely falsifies the nature of the book and makes it a different object from what it was. So what can you say about this? Adelphi is a commercial operation. They make money and they are doing well at the moment. They tend to rewrite considerably, and the criteria they rewrite to is what is piquant among Italian readers in 2008. Calasso is actually not involved very much at all in the translations from English. I don't like it. Other people might like it. You know, I'm not going to say it has to be like this, but I think it's an operation that we need to know what's going on and not imagine that Adelphi are more faithful translators than others. They're not. I would only say that in general, the reason why no attention's paid is because there's no money. Translation is famously underpaid in Italy at something between usually 10 and 20 euros a page, sometimes more for better translators. Can you imagine translating Henry Green at that kind of money? You know, you'd be getting far less than your babysitter, or the guy who cleans the street. So I'm presently retranslating 2 books by Pavese for Penguin Classics, and I'm definitely making less money than a street cleaner to do that. Okay, so there is no money. And I think also the other thing is, for all the lip service we give to literature, I don't think a lot of the editors really understand what would be required. For example, Scott Fitzgerald was just The Great Gatsby. Because Scott Fitzgerald died 70 years ago now, the rights become available and suddenly there are 5 new translations, right? And many of these new translations clearly don't understand what Scott Fitzgerald's project was. Like, the publishers called them up and said, guys, there's The Great Gatsby. Great, let's translate The Great Gatsby. And they get going immediately on The Great Gatsby. And all it would have taken would have been to say, let's sit you alongside someone who's an expert on The Great Gatsby, can talk to you a little bit about the style, about how it works, just introduce you, just make you more sensitive to certain things.
Yes.
Then the book will happen for you in a different way.
So aren't we saying...
But that's not happening, it's not happening. Lack of money and really lack of sensibility.
So you had to put an academic
No,
knowledge together with...
academic. Am I an academic?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, an expert on Fitzgerald working with the translator, wouldn't you get something better?
A sensitive native reader who really knows the text, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of, words like academic get me anxious. The kids have to go.
Back.
The kids have to go. So maybe we could, I don't know.
Yeah, we can... yes. Ilaria? They have to get back to junior college.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Have
coming.
a good day, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Bye, Claire. And we have another question here. So 1 question there and 1 question here. And another question there. Hi, Paul.
I would like to ask you, so we're a group of Professor Vassallo students.
Uh-huh.
And we're at the microphone, but I need the microphone.
He's hogging the microphone here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your insight, Professor Parks. And so we're a bunch of students from, we're the students of Professor Vassallo's class, and we're presently doing a master in translation and terminology. So some of us have taken the specialty of literary translation. So I was wondering whether, well, we've established that unfortunately there's not, you do it more for the glory, I believe, than for the money to be a literary translation.
Not
from
always.
What you...
Sometimes you can make serious money, yeah.
I understand.
Not
Okay,
with
good. Good, that's good news for us. But keeping aside the money aspect, how would you recommend budding translators to start into getting into literature if they don't know the author? So let's say more, even if they know the author, like the different types, if they want to translate or retranslate a classic, or if they want to translate a book that hasn't been published, how would you recommend we approach?
Well, you know, obviously I teach a postgraduate degree in translation in Milan, so this is a question, you know, that's in everybody's mind. Let me say, first of all, that for somebody for whom translation is a vocation, I don't believe it is wise as a young translator to exclude commercial translations, technical translations, art catalogues, and the whole range of material that will pay your bills, but will also teach you to translate. Okay. I think I translated a first novel when I was 31, and I was translating commercial material from when I was about 26 to when I was about 40. Partly because you can make, if you're fast, quite a lot of money. So I don't think the distinction between what's commercial and what's literary, in terms of the discipline required, is I mean, it's much more difficult to translate an art catalogue than to translate Moravia, for example. It's actually much more difficult to translate a work of chick lit than to translate, say, Christina Stead. So the quality, the literary quality of a text is not related to the difficulty. It is easier to translate Jane Austen than to translate chick lit. And there are reasons for that. There are obvious reasons that chick lit is very idiomatic, very engaged in a very particular local community which doesn't move easily out of, say, London or New York and so on and so forth. But how to actually get going, let's imagine that in my case I was translating quite a lot of commercial material and I did want to translate novels. Everybody looks for their own road, you know, it's every man for himself. Obviously, if you knew people, it would be much easier. And alas, a lot of the bad translations we see occur when the person knew somebody but didn't really know the language they were translating from very well. Okay, and that's happening a lot in New York today, where the people getting the translations are the people close to the publishers, but not close to the reality of the world they're translating from. So what I did was write polite letters obsessively to publishers, and obviously identifying editors who I could see were choosing particular kinds of books. I would do little researches, trying to find out. Obviously the internet didn't exist at the time, and I would try and find out who was doing what, and then I would send little samples. If you can operate as a kind of scout as well, if you can say, look, there's this work that's come out which you don't know about, which is actually terribly interesting, and here's 20 pages of translation, you know, you never know. It might happen. It's happened for some of my students like that. Not many, but it has happened. So, you know, but sometimes one of the problems is many people choose translation because they love being in a room with a text, quiet and comfortable, you know, in a sort of padded cell, away from the dangerous world, but writing about the dangerous world, as it were. So there is a kind of mindset to people who choose translation. And unfortunately, to get translation work, you need a completely different mindset. You know, you need to be aggressive and get out there.
In the world.
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Thank you for the lecture, or the talk and the discussion. I wanted to ask you about the Italian not being Italian, and it seems that publishers in general are very cautious about style or divine language in translation. And so my question is, why is that, and how is your own experience when, if you try to write English that is not immediately correct English, a standard English, how have your publishers reacted to that? And do you think it's different for you now when you are established than at the beginning? So I would just like to hear a bit more about your...
Question.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. There's
you.
obviously, PhD theses can be written about this. Let's just remember that in Italy, 1861, unification of Italy, only 5% of people, more or less, as far as we know, were speaking what was to become the national language. A government policy of imposing this language with as many instruments as possible. One of those instruments was translation. So Italy was translating, as has been done, for example, in some minority languages. Well, I think thinking of Irish or Welsh, like a deliberate policy of translating masterpieces into our language in order to consolidate our language. And in Italy particularly then, insistence on standard usage of the language in the translation. So you get the kind of slightly grotesque situation that somebody like Dickens is deliberately opening English up to all the kinds of strangenesses of regional English and idiomatic English, because English is a very confident language when Dickens is writing, and English can accept all this kind of crazy stuff coming in, and then Dickens is being translated and all this stuff is being removed, which is actually part of the meaning of the text, its inclusiveness, okay? So that is a traditional thing in Italy, and, I can speak here to Eleonora, who translates into Italian. I remember cases recently where people were insisting on the use of the past historic or something where it was clearly inappropriate today. Translation in Italy is a very conservative instrument, and the subjunctive is used much more in translation than it's used in standard Italian writing today, and so on and so forth. English tends to be the opposite, with some negative aspects to it as well. English tends to be open to the idea of subversion and change. And one of the results of that is that often when you get just calques from the Italian, just bad, you get an Italian organization of the sentence which hasn't been properly thought out, and they think, oh, this is terribly interesting, so you get, it's often very difficult in English translations to see the wood from the trees. Because for style to work, obviously, what's standard in Italian has to be standard in English, and then what's different in Italian has to somehow be done with, and you get English translations that are just so kind of Latinate and organized in a Ciceronian or whatever fashion that gets lost. Obviously, it's much easier for me today, now that I have a certain, it's easier for me to say to the publisher, look, guys, but what I always do is I always say, I want you to look at a sample and say if you want me to do this book. I don't say, oh, great, I'm going to do this book. And then I say, I want you to see what I'm going to do before we... so with the Pavese, send them 10 pages of Pavese and say, look, this stuff is really strange in Italian. But strange in a kind of fluent way, so this is what I'm trying to do, So that's the situation. Again, though, the publishers are surprised sometimes to see you taking so much care. They really are. So there you go.
We have at least one more question, Paul. And two questions, okay. Microphone.
I should say too, let me just say that publishers are not all the same. You meet one guy who's terribly attentive and other people who are totally careless, I think. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. English translation is not my field. I come from a totally different, but I was intrigued by what you were saying, where I understand that the role of the translator, the primary role of the translator, is to deliver the translated work in the context in which it was written. So I was particularly intrigued when you were talking about the Verga translation of Galantuomini. And if I heard you correctly, because my hearing is not what it should be, you said that Penguin Classics actually chose the title Bigwigs against other translations such as Men of Honor. And I will take...
Those other translations were just suggestions of mine. I haven't actually seen another translation of Galantuomini. Some of the Verga was also translated by D.H. Lawrence, but as far as I know, as far as I've been able to see, the only one is that one, Bigwigs.
But just to take the two versions, Bigwigs and Men of Honor, in the context of delivering the translation in the context in which it was written, I think that, as most of us over here would say, Men of Honor is much closer to the mark than Bigwigs. Bigwigs has connotations of barons, very important people, moguls, etc. Whereas the term men of honor does give the negative connotation which galantuomini in Italian, especially in Sicilian, has. So my question is this. Even if the term bigwigs was not used by a publisher, let us take the hypothetical case that it were. My question is, what criteria do publishers use in order to decide on one version against another?
They don't.
If only we knew.
They don't.
Thank you very much. That was very short and succinct.
They don't have criteria. Some of them do. There are some people, like you look at a publisher like Pushkin Press, which is a small press, which is very much dedicated to translation. And I think Pushkin Press do have people there who are really thinking about this stuff. Bigwigs, let me say that the guy who translated that was a guy called McWilliam. He was already in his 70s or 80s when he was translating, which is not a problem, but he was a Cambridge academic who was very much not exposed to the world. And he's very much using an idiom which was already out of date in the UK when he was using it. The word bigwig has a totally different class feeling than the question of obviously when we move to Sicily and possible mafia. We know that galantuomini is a positive word that's become negative, so that in that sense totally different from bigwig. I think what makes it interesting now, in the last 50 years, we've become much more aware of each other's communities, and I think English people now would be open even to leaving the title maybe even the same. Okay, almost.
Yeah.
Certainly, there are a lot more English words available. But a word like honourables, remember, honourable in English is used, and also can be used negatively. Certainly Dickens is constantly using the word honourable to suggest that somebody is not honourable, okay? So yeah. But no, there's no criteria. Nobody is thinking about this stuff. The academic world is doing its academic stuff, okay? The publishing world is selling books. And nobody's in the middle saying, yeah, but we could sell just as many of these books and actually make them a bit better,
And
I think
Paul is also a translator.
if I were to buy a translation that I know in the first place that it has been adapted to a particular readership, I wouldn't buy it. Mm-hmm. Because when I buy a translation, I want a faithful translation of the author, which if I'm not able to read, I want a faithful translation. So the question is that when someone is translating literature, he has to let the author himself guide him. Other things are secondary. Whether it's the primary audience or the secondary audience that you have to cater for, that's something secondary to considering the author and what his message is. Let's say, for instance, you mentioned Dickens, right? Now, many of Dickens's novels, they include dialects and regionalizations. How can a translator say in Maltese do that? It's impossible.
No.
It's impossible.
Fortunately, when something's impossible, it's not a problem.
No, but the thing is this. What is possible to translate, you should translate. And you should not simplify, even if the reader is unable to understand it. Yeah, but when things are not possible to translate, then obviously you have to adapt.
Yeah. Can I just say, obviously, everything I've said, I think, indicates that I'm on your side with this. But let's remember that translation is itself a huge adaptation to an audience, okay? So when I translate, I'm making the book available to somebody. I'm making the book possible for someone. So many things will sometimes occur where you're staying close to the author and you know that the reader is not going to be able to appreciate this because there's some context that's missing or in his culture that's not going to make that possible. So you might be alert to that and trying to allow that information or allow that to come in some way, okay? So you are as a translator, you are inevitably thinking about the reader of the book in your language. But I agree that the criteria for doing it, the criteria for anything you do, the criteria should be my experience of the original. What was the original? Okay. Which obviously is not going to be the same for every translator.
Yeah, because frequently if you compare, for instance, French translation with English versions, you find out that the English texts have a tendency of changing the imperfect tense used in French into the simple English, the simple past tense in English. Very often this is a stylistic mistake, because when the French use the imperfect, let's say Flaubert, when Flaubert uses the imperfect in his text, he's building the backgrounding of the narrative, and while the English translation has a simple past tense, the translator, when he uses the simple past tense in English, he's losing all the backgrounding information which Flaubert wants to pass to his readers.
What would you use as an imperfect?
When you compare, for instance, French grammar with, if you study translation as a part of the language.
What is the imperfect in English?
The imperfect in English, for instance, in French, if you say j'ai regardé, it would be I was, sorry?
In English.
In English, it would be, if it's a translation from French into English, it would be I was looking, or...
No, the past progressive is not an imperfect. It's a specific period of time in which I was looking. The problem
I'm sorry, the problem is this. When I studied French, I studied it through translation, and I had the Whitmarsh approach and everything. Now, if you look at French grammar when explaining translation, and you compare the same situation with translators translating from French into English, you find that they are not following the manual for grammatical translation.
Okay, let me just say something about tenses, because there's the same problem from Italian as well. And I think there's also a misunderstanding here about how the English used tenses in the past. So if we have a marked use of the imperfect in the Italian, and we want to mark it in English, we would have to use something like a structure with would. Like when I was a child, I would go to church on Sundays. Okay, so we have something that corresponds to an Italian imperfect, but it's very marked. It's marked in the sense that I've underlined it. Okay, so I wouldn't continue then to underline it. I would say, if I went, when I was a child, I would go to church on Sundays. After the service, we came out and had a cup of tea. That is, English tends to mark an imperfect and then continue with the past simple, and the imperfect is understood. Another use you could use is used to. And the same thing with the past perfect. That is, English uses the past simple as a hugely flexible instrument to cover past perfects, imperfects, and so on. But if we need to mark at the beginning of a sequence of verbs, we will do it with a marked verb. So it becomes incredibly difficult to actually compare verb for verb, tenses in these languages. It took me years to understand what was going on in Italian.
Shall we?
Call it a day.
Yes,
okay.
We shall call it a day. Thank you very, very much. Thanks.